The air hung heavy over Willow Creek Plantation on that summer day in 1850, thick with humidity and unspoken dread. Martha Thornton stood on the grand porch of the main house, her silhouette stark against the white columns, as she surveyed her domain with cold, calculating eyes. At 45, the widow's reputation across 3 counties of Georgia was as formidable as the fortune she had inherited following her husband's unexpected passing 3 years prior. "Mistress, the new arrivals are here," Samuel, her overseer, announced from the bottom step, his voice carrying a practiced neutrality that belied the tension in his shoulders. "Bring them to the south field," Martha replied without turning, her voice crisp as starched linen. "I'll inspect them there." The plantation sprawled across nearly 2,000 acres of prime Georgia soil, cotton fields stretching as far as the eye could see. Martha had transformed what was already a profitable operation into one of the most productive plantations in the state. The secret to her success, as neighboring planters would whisper at their social gatherings, was her methodical approach to what she called asset management. In the distance, a line of 12 people trudged along the dirt road toward the property, chains linking them together, their expressions vacant from exhaustion after the long journey from the auction house in Savannah. Among them was Isaiah, a powerfully built man of 30, whose eyes, despite the weariness, remained alert and observant. Beside him walked Esther, 23 years old, her back straight despite the weight of the shackles and the small bundle she carried containing her only possessions. Martha made her way deliberately to the south field, parasol protecting her pale skin from the merciless Georgia sun. The overseer had lined up the new arrivals in a row, the dust from the road still clinging to their threadbare clothing. "Names and skills," Martha commanded, stopping before the first person in line. One by one they stated their names and whatever skills they possessed: fieldwork, blacksmithing, cooking, sewing. Martha noted each response in a small leather-bound book she kept for such occasions, occasionally nodding or frowning depending on the answer. When she reached Isaiah, something in his steady gaze caught her attention. "Your name and skills," she repeated, her voice taking on an edge. "Isaiah, ma'am. I can read and write, do figures. I worked as a house servant and kept accounts for my previous master." A murmur rippled through the overseer and his assistants. Literacy was not a quality Martha typically sought or encouraged among her property, but she was nothing if not pragmatic about maximizing value. "Is that so?" she said, her eyebrow arching. "We shall see." When she reached Esther, the young woman's quiet dignity was equally striking. "Esther, ma'am, I can cook, sew, tend to children, and assist with household management." Martha's cold eyes assessed Esther with particular attention. "You'll work in the house then. My personal assistant recently became unavailable." The words sent a chill through the assembled group. Everyone knew what had happened to Martha's previous personal assistant. The rumors of harsh punishment for a minor infraction had spread even to the auction block in Savannah. As twilight descended over Willow Creek, Isaiah found himself assigned to a cabin shared with 3 other men. The cramped quarters smelled of sweat and despair, but the exhausted newcomers were too tired to do more than claim their sleeping pallets before collapsing. "Don't get too comfortable with your fancy reading skills," whispered Thomas, a man who had been on the plantation for 5 years. "The mistress has strange ideas about improvement and bloodlines. She watches everyone, decides who's worthy of her special attention." "What do you mean?" Isaiah asked, his voice barely audible. Thomas glanced nervously at the door. "She calls it God's work. Breeding the best stock, like we're cattle. Keeps records of everything in those books of hers. If she thinks you've got qualities worth preserving, she'll match you up. No choice in the matter." Isaiah's stomach tightened as the implications became clear. "And if someone refuses?" Thomas's laugh was hollow. "Nobody refuses, Martha Thornton. Not twice, anyway." Meanwhile, in the main house, Esther was being shown her duties by the housekeeper, an older woman named Ruth, whose eyes carried decades of witnessed sorrows. "You'll sleep here," Ruth said, indicating a small room off the kitchen. Be ready before sunrise. The mistress takes breakfast at 7 sharp. Esther nodded, taking in every detail of the grand house with its polished wood floors and expensive furnishings. Knowledge, she had learned early in life, could be power, or at least protection. What happened to the woman before me? Esther dared to ask when they were alone. Ruth's face hardened. Sarah made a mistake with the accounts. Mistress Thornton doesn't tolerate errors. She was sold to the Wilkins plantation, downriver. Ruth lowered her voice further. But that was after 3 weeks in the cellar. That night, as darkness wrapped around Willow Creek plantation, the new arrivals lay awake, each contemplating the uncertain future that awaited them. In the distance, the mournful sound of someone singing softly drifted through the night air, an old spiritual about deliverance that seemed to carry both warning and hope. Isaiah stared at the rough wooden ceiling above his pallet, his mind racing with plans and calculations. He had survived 3 different owners already in his lifetime. He would survive this one too, he promised himself, whatever it took. In her opulent bedroom, Martha Thornton sat at her desk, meticulously updating her ledgers by lamplight. She recorded the day's acquisition costs, the assigned tasks, and her initial observations of each person's potential value to her operation. When she reached Isaiah's entry, she paused, tapping her pen thoughtfully against the page. Literacy could be useful, she murmured to herself, if properly controlled. Martha turned to a separate volume bound in red leather, her breeding journal, where she tracked lineages, traits, and potential pairings with the same clinical precision that other planters might use for their prized horses. This was her true innovation, the system she believed would maximize the value of her human property across generations. God's work, she whispered, satisfied with the day's additions to her empire, improving the stock. The next morning dawned hot and bright, the Georgia summer showing no mercy. Isaiah was assigned to assist the plantation's bookkeeper, a nervous white man named Collins, who eyed Isaiah with suspicion and resentment. "Mistress says you're to help with the inventory," Collins said curtly, "but don't think that makes you special. One mistake and you'll be back in the fields." Isaiah kept his expression neutral. "Yes, sir, I understand." "Upay." The ledgers were extensive, tracking every minute aspect of the plantation's operations. Bales of cotton harvested from each field, supplies purchased, food distributed, punishments administered. Isaiah absorbed every detail as he worked, building a mental map of Willow Creek's operations and hierarchy. By midday, word had spread through the quarters that there would be a gathering that evening. These events, Isaiah learned, were Martha's way of maintaining control through public displays of power. "Everyone must attend," Thomas explained during their brief meal break. "She'll introduce the new people, remind us all of the rules, maybe make an example of someone who stepped out of line." Esther's first day in the main house had been grueling. Martha Thornton demanded perfection in every aspect of her household's operation, from the temperature of her morning tea to the precise arrangement of her wardrobe. The slightest deviation earned a cold stare or cutting remark. "You'll attend me at the gathering tonight," Martha informed Esther as she inspected the dinner settings. "Wear the uniform Ruth provided. I expect you to observe everything carefully. It will be educational." "Yes, ma'am," Esther replied, her eyes downcast but her mind alert, already assessing potential allies and threats among the household staff. As dusk fell, the entire plantation population was assembled in the yard between the main house and the quarters. Martha Thornton appeared on the porch, dressed in an elegant dark blue gown that emphasized her position of authority. Isaiah noted how the atmosphere immediately changed. Conversations ceased, bodies stiffened, eyes lowered. "Willow Creek prospers because of order," Martha began, her voice carrying easily across the yard. "Order is God's design, each creature in its proper place, fulfilling its proper function." She descended the steps slowly, Esther following 2 paces behind, carrying a small wooden box. "Those who accept their place and perform their duties will find life here tolerable." Martha's gaze swept over the assembled people. Those who resist God's ordained order will find correction. She gestured to Samuel, who dragged forward a man Isaiah hadn't seen before. His back bore fresh whip marks, visible through his torn shirt. Daniel here thought he could keep some of the harvest for himself, Martha announced. Property stealing from its owner, a perversion of the natural order. What followed was a calculated demonstration of power, not excessive violence, but something perhaps more terrifying in its cold, bureaucratic precision. Martha had Daniel's rations reduced, his work quota increased, and announced that any further infractions would result in his sale to the notoriously brutal plantation in the next county. Throughout the proceedings, Martha maintained the same calm, almost pleasant tone one might use to discuss the weather. The true horror lay in the complete absence of anger or emotion. This was simply business to her, the necessary maintenance of her property. When the gathering concluded, the community dispersed silently back to their quarters. Isaiah found himself walking beside an older man who had been introduced to him as Solomon, one of the few who had been at Willow Creek since before Martha took control. "It wasn't always like this," Solomon whispered, his voice barely audible. Her husband was harsh, but conventional. After he died, something changed in her. She started talking about bloodlines and improvement, studying books on animal breeding and applying the principles to us. Isaiah glanced back at the main house, where Martha stood conversing with her overseer, Esther still positioned dutifully behind her. "Has anyone ever escaped?" he asked. Solomon's bitter laugh was answer enough. "3 tried last spring. The dogs found 2 of them. The 3rd made it to the river." He paused. "Martha had their bodies returned and displayed for 3 days, a lesson, she called it." That night, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion, Isaiah crept out to the small creek that ran behind the quarters. The night was alive with the sounds of cicadas and frogs, the air thick with moisture. He knelt by the water, splashing his face and trying to clear his thoughts. A rustle in the bushes made him freeze. Turning slowly, he found himself face to face with Esther, who had also sought the momentary solitude of the creek bank. "You shouldn't be out here," she whispered. "If the night watchman finds you—" "I know," Isaiah interrupted. "Same goes for you." A moment of understanding passed between them, 2 souls recognizing a similar spark of determination. "She keeps records of everything," Esther said quietly. "In her study, breeding plans, punishment schedules, sales projections, she spent an hour showing me how to file them properly." Isaiah absorbed this information silently. "Knowledge is the only advantage we might have," he finally replied. "The only advantage we have is each other," Esther corrected him. "No one survives Willow Creek alone." A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness, and they quickly separated, returning to their respective quarters before they could be discovered. In her bedroom, Martha Thornton sat at her desk reviewing her journals by lamplight. She paused at the entries for Isaiah and Esther, adding a few notes based on her observations during their first day. Both showed intelligence and composure under pressure, valuable traits. She made a notation in the margin of her breeding journal. "Promising additions," she murmured to herself, satisfied with her investment. Tomorrow she would begin testing the limits of their capabilities, assessing their true value to her carefully constructed empire. Outside, a distant summer storm rumbled across the Georgia sky, lightning briefly illuminating the sprawling plantation below. The fields where Martha Thornton's fortune grew, the cabins where people lived in fear, and the grand house where she plotted the futures of those she considered mere property. The rain, when it finally came, brought no relief from the oppressive heat, just as the night brought no escape from the reality of Willow Creek Plantation. 1 month into his time at Willow Creek, Isaiah had established himself as indispensable to the plantation's bookkeeping operations. Collins, the white accountant, had grudgingly come to rely on Isaiah's meticulous attention to detail and facility with numbers, though he never missed an opportunity to remind Isaiah of his status. "You may know your figures," Collins remarked one stifling afternoon as they worked through the quarterly inventory. "But don't forget what you are." Isaiah kept his eyes on the ledger, his face a careful mask. "Yes, sir, just trying to be useful." What Collins didn't know, what no one knew, was that Isaiah had been using his position to gather intelligence. Each night, after completing his assigned duties, he would commit to memory the most important details from Martha's business correspondence, inventory records, and financial statements. He was creating a mental map of Willow Creek's operations, its weaknesses, its connections to the outside world. Meanwhile, Esther had solidified her role in the main house, always at Martha's side, learning the mistress's routines and preferences. Martha Thornton was a creature of rigid habits. Breakfast at 7, business correspondence until 10, plantation inspections before the midday heat, account reviews in the late afternoon, and social correspondence in the evenings. She retired precisely at 9:30 each night, after a small glass of sherry and a chapter from whatever book currently occupied her attention. "You're proving quite capable," Martha told Esther one evening as the younger woman brushed out her employer's greying hair. "Far more so than your predecessor." "Thank you, ma'am," Esther replied, her eyes appropriately lowered. "I'm grateful for the opportunity to serve." Martha studied Esther's reflection in the mirror. "Tell me, did you have any children at your previous placement?" The question, seemingly casual but weighted with implication, caused Esther's hands to still momentarily before continuing their rhythmic brushing. "No, ma'am." Good health, though. No illnesses or weaknesses in your family line?" "None that I'm aware of, ma'am. My mother lived to be quite old." Martha nodded, satisfied. "Good stock matters, Esther. In all things, the Lord rewards those who improve upon what he has provided." That night, Esther made her way to the arranged meeting place, an abandoned tool shed near the edge of the north field. These clandestine gatherings had begun 2 weeks earlier, a small group of trusted individuals meeting under the guise of prayer sessions, which even Martha permitted as they aligned with her professed Christian values. Isaiah was already there, along with Solomon, Ruth from the house, and Thomas. A single candle provided meager illumination as they huddled together, voices barely above whispers. "The Thornton Foundation dinner is set for October 15th, Esther reported. "Martha's been planning it for weeks. Every important family in the county will be here. All the focus will be on impressing the guests," Ruth added. "The house will be in chaos." Isaiah nodded, absorbing the information. "The cash box will be full too. She's paying out the quarterly settlements to her suppliers that week." Solomon, whose 60 years had taught him caution, shook his head. "It's still too risky. The punishment for running is—" "We know the risks," Thomas interrupted. "But opportunities like this don't come often." The group fell silent, each contemplating the terrible consequences of failure and the unimaginable promise of freedom. "There's something else," Esther said finally. "I found her breeding journal." The atmosphere in the shed shifted, tension crackling like electricity before a storm. "She has plans for all of us," Esther continued, her voice steady despite the horror of what she described. "Detailed records going back years, bloodlines, traits, projected values of offspring." Isaiah's jaw tightened. "Does she have plans for you?" Esther's eyes met his in the flickering candlelight. "For both of us. Together. She's scheduled it for after the Harvest Festival." The revelation hung in the air, giving their nebulous escape plans a sudden, concrete urgency. "The dinner," Isaiah decided. "That's our window, but we need more information, routes, patrols, safe houses." "I've been asking questions of the delivery drivers," Thomas volunteered. "There's talk of a station about 20 miles north, a sympathetic Quaker family." 20 miles with dogs and searchers behind us," Solomon muttered. "We won't be alone," Isaiah stated with quiet conviction. "There are others who will join us when the time comes." The meeting concluded with each person assigned specific tasks, information to gather, supplies to slowly accumulate, signals to develop for the night of the escape. As they prepared to disperse, returning to their quarters one by one to avoid detection, Ruth gripped Isaiah's arm. "Be careful with Martha," the older woman warned. "She sees things others miss. She's already watching you and Esther more closely than the others." "What do you mean?" Isaiah asked. Ruth's expression was grave in the dimming candlelight. "She thinks you two are special specimens, prime breeding stock in her twisted mind. She won't let such valuable property slip away easily." The following day, Martha summoned Isaiah to the main house, an unusual occurrence that immediately put him on alert. He was led to her private study, a room few ever entered, with walls lined with books on agriculture, animal husbandry, and financial management. "Isaiah," Martha greeted him, not looking up from the document she was studying. "Mr. Collins speaks highly of your abilities with figures." "I'm glad to be of service, ma'am," he responded carefully. Martha finally raised her eyes to assess him. "I have a special project that requires discretion and intelligence. You will assist me with my personal records each evening after your regular duties are complete." Isaiah felt a chill despite the room's warmth. These would be the breeding records Esther had mentioned, the documentation of Martha's grand design to treat humans like livestock. "Of course, ma'am," he replied, keeping his voice neutral. Martha rose from her desk and retrieved a red, leather-bound book from a locked cabinet. "These records represent the future of Willow Creek, the scientific management of our most valuable assets." She opened the book, revealing pages of meticulous notations, names organized in family trees, physical characteristics listed and rated, projected values calculated across generations. "The work we do here is God's work," Martha continued, her voice taking on the cadence of a sermon. "Improving upon nature, maximizing potential. Just as we select the strongest cotton seeds for next year's planting, we must apply the same principles to all our resources." Isaiah forced himself to nod as though in understanding, while his stomach churned with disgust. "A very progressive approach, ma'am." "Precisely," Martha smiled, pleased with his apparent comprehension. "Too many planters operate on outdated models. But science and scripture both support improvement through selective breeding." She turned several pages in the journal, coming to a section marked with the current year. "You'll be helping me update these records and calculate projections for the next generation." Isaiah saw his own name on the page, alongside Esther's, with notations about their physical condition, intelligence, and estimated value. Beside their names was a scheduled date, October 17th, just after the Foundation dinner. "You and Esther will contribute significantly to Willow Creek's future prosperity," Martha stated matter-of-factly. "Your children will inherit your intelligence and her resilience, valuable traits properly managed." Isaiah maintained his composure through sheer force of will. "As you say, ma'am." "You begin tonight," Martha declared, closing the journal. 7 o'clock, after supper. That evening, as Isaiah worked under Martha's supervision, carefully transcribing her notations into a new ledger, he committed every detail to memory. Names, dates, locations of previous sales, connections with other plantations involved in similar breeding programs. Each piece of information might prove useful, not just for their escape, but perhaps for others still trapped in Martha's twisted vision of progress. 3 weeks passed, filled with careful preparation and mounting tension. The small group of conspirators had grown to include 15 people, each sworn to secrecy, each driven by desperate hope. Maps were memorized, supplies gradually accumulated, roles assigned for the night of the Foundation dinner. Then disaster struck. One evening, as Isaiah was returning to his quarters after his session in Martha's study, Samuel the overseer intercepted him, accompanied by 2 armed men. "Mistress wants to see you," Samuel stated flatly. "Now." Isaiah was marched back to the main house, his mind racing through possibilities. Had they been discovered? Was this the end of their carefully laid plans? In the study, Martha sat rigidly behind her desk. Beside her stood a trembling young boy of about 12, James, who worked in the stables and had recently begun attending the secret meetings. Isaiah, Martha's voice was ice. James here has something to tell you. The boy's terrified eyes met Isaiah's for a brief, agonizing moment before dropping to the floor. I'm sorry, he whispered. They caught me with the map. I told them everything. Isaiah's world contracted to a pinpoint of dread. A map of the northern route to the Ohio River, Martha said, unfolding a crudely drawn but accurate rendering of their planned escape route, along with a list of names. Quite an ambitious conspiracy. She rose from her desk, circling Isaiah like a predator. Did you really think you could steal from me 15 of my most valuable properties, orchestrating a mass escape? Isaiah remained silent, mind working furiously to assess the damage. Who had been implicated? Who might still remain free to carry on the plan? Your intelligence made you valuable, Isaiah, Martha continued, but it also made you dangerous. A costly miscalculation on my part. She turned to Samuel. Bring them all to the south field, everyone on the list. I want this addressed before the sun sets. The next hour unfolded like a nightmare. Isaiah, Esther, Solomon, Thomas, Ruth, and 10 others were assembled in the south field, surrounded by armed overseers and Martha's household staff. The entire plantation population was forced to watch, a captive audience to the punishment about to be meted out. Martha addressed the assembled crowd, her voice carrying across the hushed field. Willow Creek functions through order and obedience to God's design. Those who reject their divinely ordained place threaten not just my property, but the very foundation of our society. She walked slowly before the line of accused conspirators. The Bible tells us, servants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling. These 15 have chosen to reject Scripture and natural law. Isaiah caught Esther's eye down the line. In that glance was a wealth of communication, regret for their failed plan, but no regret for having tried. No surrender to Martha's perverse worldview. Normally, such offense would merit immediate sale to the sugar plantations in Louisiana, Martha continued, a death sentence by another name, as we all know. A murmur ran through the crowd. The Louisiana sugar plantations were notorious for working people to death within years. However, Martha's voice took on an almost contemplative tone. Valuable property should be corrected, not destroyed. So I have devised a more instructive punishment. She nodded to Samuel, who stepped forward with a ledger. Each conspirator will receive 30 lashes. Then they will be separated, distributed across different sections of the plantation, never to communicate again. Any further attempt at escape will result in sale to Louisiana, no exceptions. She turned to face Isaiah directly. Except for the ringleaders, Isaiah and Esther have demonstrated exceptional qualities: intelligence, resourcefulness, leadership, qualities too valuable to waste, but too dangerous to leave unchecked. Martha's smile was terrible in its calm rationality. They will remain here under constant supervision. Their planned pairing will proceed as scheduled. Their children will be raised in the nursery, educated to appreciate their proper place in God's order. A controlled experiment in hereditary improvement. The horror of this pronouncement, a lifetime of captivity, not just for them, but for generations to come, struck Isaiah like a physical blow. This was worse than the lash, worse than Louisiana. This was the destruction of hope itself. As the first conspirator was tied to the whipping post, Isaiah caught sight of James, the boy whose capture had unraveled their plans. The child stood apart from the crowd, tears streaming down his face. Isaiah managed to catch his eye and gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod of forgiveness. The boy's betrayal had come under duress. No one could blame him for breaking under Martha's methods. The Georgia sun began its descent toward the horizon as the punishments were carried out with methodical precision. Each crack of the whip seemed to echo across the fields, a brutal counterpoint to the soft evening breeze that rustled through the cotton plants. Isaiah and Esther were left for last, forced to watch as their friends and co-conspirators suffered before them. When Isaiah's turn came, he refused to cry out, denied Martha the satisfaction of hearing his pain. Each lash tore into his flesh, but his mind remained fixed on a single thought: this is not the end. As long as breath remained in his body, he would not surrender to Martha Thornton's vision of the world. As twilight deepened into night at Willow Creek Plantation, 15 broken bodies were returned to their quarters, dreams of freedom seemingly shattered. But in the darkness of the slave hospital, where Isaiah and Esther were taken to have their wounds treated, whispered words passed between them in moments of unwatched privacy. "This changes nothing," Isaiah breathed, his voice barely audible through the pain. "It only delays the inevitable." Esther's hand found his in the darkness. "We'll find another way." But outside, the Georgia night was alive with the sounds of crickets and distant thunder, nature's rhythms continuing regardless of human suffering. In her study, Martha Thornton made notations in her journal about the day's events, calculating the economic impact of the punishments and adjusting her breeding schedule accordingly. The conspiracy had been broken, but the spirit behind it remained, a spark that could not be extinguished by whips or chains or even Martha's cold scientific cruelty. For as long as people were treated as property, resistance would continue, taking new forms, finding new paths toward that most precious and human of desires: freedom. The wound on Isaiah's back had barely begun to heal when Martha summoned him back to work. The lashes had been deliberately calculated, severe enough to serve as punishment and warning, but not so severe as to permanently damage valuable property. Each morning, Esther carefully applied a poultice of herbs to the wounds before returning to her duties in the main house, their brief moments together now supervised by one of Martha's trusted house servants. October arrived, bringing with it the first hints of autumn coolness to the Georgia air. With the harvest in full swing, Willow Creek thrummed with activity as every available hand was put to work, bringing in the cotton crop that was the source of Martha's fortune. Isaiah had been reassigned from his bookkeeping duties to field supervision, a calculated decision that kept him visible and engaged in the plantation's operations while separating him from sensitive information and potential co-conspirators. The failed escape attempt had changed the atmosphere at Willow Creek. Security had been tightened, with additional night patrols and stricter controls on movement between different areas of the plantation. The 15 who had been punished were now marked people, watched more closely, assigned separate quarters, kept apart from one another whenever possible. But Martha's greatest form of control was not physical, but psychological. The breeding program she had established now hung over Isaiah and Esther like a shadow, a future they could neither accept nor escape. October 17th remained marked in red ink in Martha's journal, the date she had selected for their first pairing just 2 days after the Thornton Foundation dinner. "You should feel honored," Martha told Esther one evening as she reviewed the seating arrangements for the upcoming dinner. "Your children will be raised with special attention, educated, trained in valuable skills. They'll never know the field labor that breaks so many." Esther kept her eyes lowered, hands steady as she arranged Martha's hair. "Yes, ma'am." "No, of course. They'll understand their place in God's order," Martha continued. "That's essential. Education without proper moral instruction leads to dangerous ideas." In the fields, Isaiah worked methodically, his mind active even as his body performed the required tasks. The failure of their escape plan had taught him valuable lessons about security, about timing, about trust. But most importantly, it had shown him that traditional escape routes were now closed to them. If freedom was to be found, it would require a different approach entirely. His opportunity came unexpectedly, 3 days before the Thornton Foundation dinner. A representative from the bank in Savannah arrived for a meeting with Martha, Mr. Archibald Peterson, a thin, nervous man with wire-rimmed spectacles who had handled the Thornton accounts for over a decade. "Isaiah," Martha called as he was passing the main house during his midday inspection rounds. "Come assist Mr. Peterson with his materials." Isaiah approached and took the heavy leather portfolio from the banker, noting the man's obvious discomfort at being on a plantation. "These quarterly reports need to be reviewed before the foundation dinner," Martha explained. "Mr. Peterson will be staying in the guest room tonight to complete our business." That evening, Isaiah was assigned to attend to Mr. Peterson's needs, bringing his dinner tray, stoking the fire in his room, ensuring he had everything required for his work. The banker barely acknowledged Isaiah's presence, but Isaiah observed everything about the man, his mannerisms, his documents, the way he meticulously organized his papers. Most importantly, Isaiah noticed the banker's signature stamp and seal, used to authenticate financial documents on behalf of the Savannah Mercantile Bank. When Peterson stepped out to consult with Martha, Isaiah took an extraordinary risk. He made a wax impression of the seal using a candle and a piece of soap, then carefully hid it beneath a loose floorboard in the hallway. The following day, as preparations for the dinner reached a fever pitch, Isaiah was reassigned to help with the heavy work of arranging furniture and setting up the large tent in the garden where drinks would be served following the meal. The entire plantation was in motion, with Martha personally overseeing every detail of the event that would showcase her wealth and influence to Georgia's elite. During a moment when the overseer's attention was directed elsewhere, Isaiah managed a brief, seemingly casual encounter with Ruth in the kitchen. "Tomorrow night," he murmured, appearing to help her with a heavy tray of glassware. "After the guests arrive, tell Esther." Ruth gave no indication she had heard, but Isaiah knew the message would be delivered. The old woman had survived decades at Willow Creek by being simultaneously visible and invisible, present for every important event, but never noticed, hearing everything but appearing to hear nothing. The day of the Thornton Foundation dinner dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for the social event of the season. Carriages began arriving in the late afternoon, bringing the wealthiest and most influential families in the county to Willow Creek. Men in fine suits and women in elaborate gowns were greeted by Martha at the front entrance, while dozens of servants worked invisibly to ensure the evening proceeded flawlessly. Isaiah was assigned to the stables, helping the drivers and footmen manage the horses and carriages. This position gave him a perfect vantage point to observe arrivals and departures, and most importantly, to identify which carriage belonged to the bank representative, Mr. Peterson. As darkness fell, the Thornton mansion glowed with candlelight, the sounds of conversation and laughter drifting across the manicured lawns. Inside, Esther moved silently through the rooms, refilling glasses and removing empty plates, her presence required, but her humanity ignored by the guests who spoke freely around her, as if she were merely another piece of furniture. She absorbed every word of their conversations, discussions of politics, business deals, market conditions in Charleston and Savannah. When the men retired to Martha's study for brandy and cigars, Esther was positioned to serve them, her eyes downcast, but her ears alert. "Your cotton yield projections are impressive, Mrs. Thornton," said Judge Williams, a portly man whose family owned 3 plantations along the Savannah River. "What's your secret?" Martha smiled modestly. "Scientific management, Judge. I believe in improving every aspect of my operation through modern methods." "She means her breeding program," interjected Colonel Harrison, his voice slightly slurred from multiple glasses of wine at dinner. "Martha's notorious for it, treats her people like thoroughbred horses." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. While such practices were common, they were rarely discussed in polite company, particularly in mixed-gender settings. Martha's smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened. "I believe in maximizing the value of all my assets, Colonel. Any successful business owner would do the same." Mr. Peterson, who had remained largely silent, cleared his throat. "The financial results speak for themselves. Willow Creek's productivity has increased 30% in the last 5 years, while maintaining stable operating costs." Most impressive. The conversation moved on to safer topics: the cotton market, shipping rates, the growing tensions with northern abolitionists. Esther continued her duties, invisible to the powerful men who decided the fates of people like her over expensive brandy and Cuban cigars. Meanwhile, in the confusion of the busy kitchen, Isaiah managed to slip away unnoticed. Using the servants' passages that connected different parts of the main house, he made his way to Martha's study, now emptied as the men had moved to the garden tent for their cigars. He had exactly 7 minutes, based on the dinner schedule, before a servant would return to refresh the brandy decanters. Working with quick practiced movements, Isaiah located the key to Martha's document cabinet, hidden exactly where Esther had described, in a small box behind a volume of biblical commentaries. He opened the cabinet and quickly found what he sought: plantation deeds, bank documents, and most importantly, letters of authorization bearing Martha's signature. Using a quill and ink from Martha's desk, Isaiah made 2 critical alterations to a bank draft authorization form. Then, replacing everything exactly as he had found it, he slipped back into the servants' corridor just as footsteps approached the study door. Outside, the October night had grown chilly, forcing the gentlemen to abandon the garden tent earlier than planned. As they returned to the warmth of the house, Mr. Peterson announced his intention to depart, citing an early morning appointment in Savannah the following day. "I really must be going, Mrs. Thornton," the banker insisted despite Martha's protestations. "The documents are all in order for your quarterly transactions. I'll have everything processed upon my return to Savannah." More, as Peterson's carriage was brought around from the stables, Isaiah was positioned nearby, ostensibly assisting with the horses, but actually waiting for his moment. When the banker climbed into his carriage, Isaiah approached with a respectful bow. "Sir, Mistress Thornton asked me to ensure you have all your documents," he said, offering up a leather folder identical to the one Peterson had brought. The banker, distracted and eager to depart, barely glanced at Isaiah as he took the folder. Yes, everything should be there. Good night." Odeem. As the carriage pulled away down the long drive of Willow Creek, Isaiah felt a momentary surge of something he had almost forgotten: hope. Inside that leather folder was the altered bank draft authorization, now bearing both Martha's signature and an impression of the banker's seal, created from Isaiah's wax mold and carefully transferred to the document. The authorization instructed the Savannah Mercantile Bank to liquidate $20,000 of Thornton assets, a tremendous sum but less than 10% of Martha's fortune, and prepare the funds for transfer to a new account in Charleston. Not enough to cripple her financially, but enough to purchase what Isaiah and Esther needed most: legitimate papers, transportation, and a new life beyond Georgia's borders. The dinner concluded near midnight, the last guests departing in a procession of expensive carriages. Martha, pleased with the evening's success, retired to her rooms, leaving the servants to handle the extensive cleanup. In the controlled chaos that followed, Isaiah managed a brief moment with Esther in the darkened pantry. "It's done," he whispered. "If it works, the funds will be ready in Savannah by Thursday." Esther's eyes showed both hope and fear. "And if it doesn't work?" "Then we run anyway," Isaiah replied grimly. "Better Louisiana than what she has planned for us." The next morning, Martha was in an expansive mood, satisfied with the impression she had made on the county's elite. She summoned Isaiah to her study, surprising him with what appeared to be a gesture of reconciliation. "Your punishment period is concluded," she announced. "You've shown appropriate contrition, and your skills are being wasted in the fields. You'll resume your bookkeeping duties immediately." Isaiah bowed his head. "Thank you, ma'am." "Additionally," Martha continued, "I've decided to proceed with the arranged pairing between you and Esther. Your intelligence and her domestic capabilities represent an ideal combination of traits." She opened her breeding journal, turning to the page marked October 17th, just 2 days away. You'll be relocated to the family cabin near the East Quarter. I expect your first child within a year." Isaiah maintained his composure through sheer force of will. "As you wish, ma'am." "This is a privilege, Isaiah," Martha said, her voice taking on the familiar cadence of her twisted philosophy. "Your children will be part of the improvement of the race. God's work, carried forward through scientific principles." Later that day, as Isaiah resumed his duties in the accounting office, Collins handed him a stack of documents to file, including copies of the correspondence that had gone out with Mr. Peterson the previous night. With a carefully neutral expression, Isaiah sorted through the papers, confirming that the banker had indeed taken the altered authorization with him to Savannah. Now there was nothing to do but wait and prepare for either outcome. If the bank processed the authorization, they would have the means to secure their freedom. If not, they would face the desperate choice between Martha's breeding program or a dangerous escape attempt with minimal resources. That night, Isaiah lay awake in his quarters, mind racing with contingency plans. The punishment for financial fraud would be immediate sale or worse. There would be no second chances if their deception was discovered. Yet the alternative, surrendering to Martha's vision of their future, was unthinkable. Across the plantation in her personal quarters off the kitchen, Esther also remained awake, mentally preparing for what lay ahead. She had spent the day carefully observing Martha's schedule and security arrangements, identifying potential weaknesses in the plantation's defenses. Knowledge was the only weapon available to them, and Esther had become a master at gathering it while appearing to see and hear nothing. October 16th passed with excruciating slowness. Every arrival of a messenger or visitor to Willow Creek sent a jolt of anxiety through Isaiah. Would this be the one bringing news that their fraud had been discovered? By evening, no alarm had been raised. Martha retired at her usual time, and the plantation settled into its nighttime routine. In the pre-dawn hours of October 17th, the day Martha had scheduled for their first pairing, Isaiah slipped from his quarters and made his way to the agreed meeting spot behind the smokehouse. Esther was already there, a small bundle containing essential items clutched in her hands. No words were needed. They had planned this moment in whispered conversations over the past 2 days. Together, they moved silently through the darkness toward the stables. The night watchman was dozing at his post, exactly as Isaiah had anticipated based on weeks of observation. They saddled 2 horses, not Martha's prized thoroughbreds, which would be missed immediately, but sturdy workhorses that might not be noticed until well into the morning. As they led the horses quietly down the back path that circumvented the main road, Isaiah cast one last look at Willow Creek Plantation. The grand house silhouetted against the night sky, the rows of cabins where people still slept in captivity, the fields where he had worked and suffered, and against all odds, maintained his humanity in the face of Martha's cold, scientific cruelty. Dawn was still 2 hours away as they mounted the horses and urged them into a steady trot heading east, away from the road to Savannah, away from the expected escape routes that would be searched first when their absence was discovered. Their destination was not the North Star that guided so many toward freedom, but the coastal port of Charleston, where Isaiah's altered bank draft would, if fortune favored them, have produced the funds they needed to purchase passage on a ship bound for Haiti or perhaps further north to Canada. As they rode through the Georgia darkness, the weight of Willow Creek seemed to lift with each mile. They were still in grave danger. Fugitive laws were harsh, and slave catchers were adept at their brutal work. But they were no longer merely property in Martha Thornton's ledger books. They had reclaimed their humanity, their agency, their right to determine their own destiny. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn as they reached a small creek that marked the boundary of Thornton property. Crossing this line felt momentous, though they knew the true journey had only just begun. "Whatever happens now," Esther said softly as they paused to water the horses, "we're free of her plans for us." Isaiah reached across the space between them, taking her hand. This touch, freely given, freely received, was itself an act of rebellion against everything Martha Thornton represented. "We were never her property," he replied. "Not in the ways that matter." As the sun began to rise over the Georgia pines, casting long shadows across the countryside, two figures on horseback continued eastward, their futures uncertain but, for the first time, their own to shape. Behind them, Willow Creek Plantation still stood as a monument to Martha Thornton's twisted vision of progress and divine order. But her carefully constructed breeding program now had two entries that would never be completed, two lives that had escaped the ledger books and claimed their rightful place in the human family. The ship rolled gently in the Charleston harbor, its weathered hull bearing the name Northern Light. On the docks, crates of cotton, tobacco and rice were being loaded by sweating laborers, supervised by red-faced foremen shouting orders that carried across the water. Among the crowd of dock workers, merchants, sailors and passengers, Isaiah and Esther moved with deliberate purpose, their newly purchased clothing marking them as free people of color, not wealthy, but respectable. 6 days had passed since their escape from Willow Creek. 6 days of tense travel through back roads and forests, avoiding towns and patrols, sleeping in abandoned barns or dense thickets. They had reached Charleston the previous evening, their forged papers, purchased with a small portion of the funds secured through Isaiah's daring fraud, withstanding cursory inspection at the city limits. "Northern Light sails on the evening tide," Isaiah said quietly as they paused at a vendor's stall, ostensibly examining bolts of cloth. "Halifax is her first port of call." Esther nodded, maintaining the appearance of a wife shopping while her husband conducted business. "And our papers? Ready for collection. Mr. Simmons will meet us at noon." Simmons was a free black dock worker whose side business in documentation had been recommended through a whispered network of contacts. For a significant price, he could provide the additional papers they would need for international travel, certificates of freedom recognized in British territory where American fugitive slave laws held no power. As they made their way through Charleston's busy streets, Isaiah remained vigilantly aware of their surroundings. Every white face could belong to a slave catcher. Every official might be carrying a description of 2 valuable escaped properties from one of Georgia's wealthiest plantations. The consequences of recapture were too terrible to contemplate. By now, Martha Thornton would have discovered not only their escape, but also the financial fraud that had enabled it. If returned to Willow Creek, they would face not just punishment, but a calculated destruction designed to break their spirits while preserving their physical capacity to labor and, in Martha's twisted vision, to reproduce according to her breeding plans. "There," Esther murmured, indicating a small office near the customs house. "That's where we're to meet him." Before they could cross the street, a commotion erupted nearby, raised voices, then shouts. A crowd began to gather around a public notice board where a man was posting new announcements. "Stay back," Isaiah cautioned, but his curiosity drew him closer, careful to remain on the periphery of the gathering crowd. From his position, he could just make out the newly posted notice, and felt his blood run cold. The notice bore crude woodcut images of 2 faces, recognizable as Isaiah and Esther, above a substantial reward offering, $1,000 for their capture and return. Below the reward information was a detailed physical description of both of them, along with the accusation of theft against their lawful owner. "They're here in Charleston," a man's voice carried from the center of the crowd. "Arrived last night or early this morning, according to reports from the city gate." Isaiah backed away carefully, returning to where Esther waited, concern evident in her eyes. "Notices," he explained tersely, "with our descriptions. We need to move, now." They abandoned their planned meeting with Simmons, instead making their way toward the less reputable section of the docks, where smaller vessels loaded and unloaded away from the primary customs inspections. Their carefully constructed plan was unraveling, requiring immediate adaptation. The Northern Light is too risky now, Isaiah decided as they huddled in the shadow of a warehouse. They'll be watching the major ships. Esther's expression remained composed, despite the danger. What alternatives do we have? Isaiah surveyed the harbor, his mind working through possibilities. There, he pointed to a weather-beaten schooner flying a Spanish flag. The Carmen, bound for Cuba according to the harbor schedule. Cuba is still slave territory, Esther reminded him. A Spanish colony with different laws. And from Cuba, we might find passage to Haiti or Jamaica. It was a desperate alteration to their carefully laid plans, but with Charleston now alerted to their presence, they had no choice but to adapt or face capture. Using a portion of their carefully hoarded funds, Isaiah approached a group of Spanish sailors unloading crates from a rowboat. With a mixture of broken Spanish and universal currency, he negotiated passage aboard the Carmen for himself and his wife, presenting their basic papers, but knowing they would face less scrutiny on the smaller vessel headed to a non-American port. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, Isaiah and Esther slipped aboard the Carmen, posing as a free black couple seeking trading opportunities in Havana. The ship's captain, a grizzled Spaniard named Vargas, asked few questions after receiving payment in gold coins, half in advance, half to be paid upon arrival in Cuba. From the deck of the schooner, Charleston harbor spread out before them, the bustling port a mixture of opportunity and danger. Somewhere in that city, men were actively searching for them, tempted by Martha Thornton's substantial reward. Every moment they remained in American territory was a moment too long. "Cast off!" Captain Vargas shouted, and sailors moved to obey, releasing the moorings that held the Carmen to American soil. As the ship began to move with the outgoing tide, Isaiah allowed himself a moment of cautious hope. They had made it this far, escaped Willow Creek, secured funds, reached Charleston, and now were departing American shores. Each step had been fraught with danger, each success temporary and fragile. The Carmen cleared the harbor as dusk fell, the lights of Charleston receding behind them. The October wind filled the sails, carrying them southward toward uncertain freedom. On deck, Isaiah and Esther stood together, watching America, the only home they had ever known, yet a land where they had never been truly free, disappear into the gathering darkness. Below decks, in the cramped quarters assigned to them, Esther finally gave voice to the question that had been building since their desperate flight from Willow Creek. "Do you think she'll follow us? Beyond American waters?" Isaiah considered the question carefully. He had come to know Martha Thornton's mind through their forced proximity, had studied her methods and motivations as a means of survival. "It's not just about the money we took," he said finally. "Though that would be enough for most owners to pursue us. For Martha, it's about her system, her vision of improvement and control. We're not just escaped property to her, we're a challenge to her entire world view." Esther nodded, understanding the truth of his assessment. "So, yes, she'll pursue us. As far as her influence reaches," Isaiah confirmed, "which is why we can't stop in Cuba. It must be Haiti or further north to British Canada." The Carmen's journey southward was mercifully uneventful for the first 2 days. Isaiah and Esther kept largely to themselves, aware that even aboard a Spanish vessel, American ideas about race and slavery might influence how they were perceived and treated. Captain Vargas, for his part, treated them with professional indifference. They were paying passengers, nothing more or less. On the 3rd day, as the ship navigated the Bahama Channel, a lookout spotted sails on the horizon, a larger vessel changing course to intercept their path. Captain Vargas observed the approaching ship through his spyglass, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "American naval vessel," he announced to his first mate, signaling us to heave to for inspection. Isaiah, overhearing this exchange, felt a surge of dread. Even in international waters, American ships often exercised the right to search vessels suspected of carrying contraband or fugitives. "What do they want with us?" Vargas demanded, when an American officer boarded the Carmen an hour later. "Routine inspection, Captain," the officer replied with practiced neutrality. "We have reports of certain stolen property being transported out of Charleston." Isaiah and Esther, hidden in a storage compartment beneath their assigned quarters, listened to the muffled sounds of the search party moving through the ship. This contingency had been part of their desperate planning, a hiding place secured with additional payment to one of the Carmen's crew, who had his own reasons to avoid official scrutiny. The search continued for over an hour, footsteps and voices moving above and around them as the American sailors methodically checked the schooner from bow to stern. Finally, the sounds receded, followed by the distinct noise of the boarding party returning to their vessel. When the crewman finally came to release them from their hiding place, his expression was grim. "They had descriptions," he explained, as he helped them out of the cramped compartment. "And a name, Martha Thornton. They mentioned her specifically, asking if we'd seen her stolen property. The confirmation of Martha's reach, extending to American naval vessels in international waters, was chilling but not surprising. Her connections among Georgia's elite, showcased at the Thornton Foundation dinner, included government officials and military officers. Her influence was being deployed in full force to recapture what she considered her valuable breeding stock. "How much farther to Havana?" Isaiah asked. "2 days with favorable winds," the sailor replied. "But I must warn you, the Americans have sent word ahead. Cuban authorities will be watching for you." This news forced another change to their already improvised plans. Cuba, originally intended as a brief waypoint, now represented another territory where Martha's influence might reach them. "We need a different destination," Isaiah told Esther that night as they huddled in their quarters, speaking in whispers despite the privacy. "Haiti is our best hope now. The independent Black Republic, formed through successful slave revolution, had a policy of offering asylum to escaped slaves from American territories. Though politically isolated and economically challenged, Haiti represented something precious, land where their status as human beings, rather than property, would be recognized without question. The captain won't change course without significant compensation," Esther pointed out. Their funds, while substantial by the standards of their previous lives, were being rapidly depleted by the constant need to purchase cooperation and silence. "Then we'll offer what we must," Isaiah decided. "We've come too far to falter now." Captain Vargas proved receptive to their proposal, though the price he named for the diversion to Haiti's southern coast, away from the more closely monitored port of Port-au-Prince, would leave them with barely enough for basic necessities upon arrival. The Carmen altered course the following morning, now heading southeast toward the island of Hispaniola. 5 days later, the mountains of Haiti's southern peninsula appeared on the horizon, their lush green slopes rising dramatically from the Caribbean Sea. For Isaiah and Esther, the sight represented something they had scarcely allowed themselves to imagine: actual freedom, not just escape from bondage. The Carmen anchored in a small bay near the town of Les Cayes, unwilling to risk the main harbor where officials might have received communications from American or Cuban authorities. A local fisherman, engaged by Captain Vargas, transported Isaiah and Esther to shore in his small boat, accepting their final American coins as payment. As they stepped onto Haitian soil, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were free, legally, undeniably free, but also alone in a foreign country whose language they didn't speak, with minimal resources and no connections. The euphoria of escape was tempered by the practical challenges of building a new life from nothing. The small coastal town of Les Cayes bustled with activity, its predominantly black population moving with the confidence of people who had never known legal enslavement or who had thrown off those chains a generation earlier. French and Haitian Creole were the languages of commerce and daily life, with Isaiah and Esther's American English marking them immediately as foreigners. Using their last funds, they secured modest lodging and began the process of establishing themselves in this new world. Isaiah's literacy and facility with numbers proved valuable, as did Esther's domestic skills. Within weeks, Isaiah had found work as an assistant to a shipping agent who valued his ability to communicate with English-speaking captains, while Esther earned additional income through seamstress work. Their life was humble but dignified. A small rented room, simple meals, days filled with honest work freely chosen. After the oppression of Willow Creek, even these basic freedoms felt like extraordinary luxury. No one owned their labor, no one documented their movements, no one planned the use of their bodies according to a breeding schedule inscribed in a red leather journal. 3 months after their arrival in Haiti, as they sat together on the beach watching the sunset over the Caribbean, Esther shared news that brought both joy and anxiety. "I'm with child," she said simply, her hand moving instinctively to her abdomen. Isaiah's expression transformed, wonder, happiness, and then a shadow of concern. "Martha would have recorded this in her journal," he said quietly, "another entry in her ledger of human property." "But our child will be born free," Esther replied, her voice firm with conviction. "That's what matters now. The past is behind us." Yet even as she spoke these words, both knew that the past was never truly left behind. Martha Thornton's reach had extended to American naval vessels in international waters. Who could say where her influence might end? As long as she lived, as long as her twisted vision of improvement drove her actions, Isaiah and Esther would need to remain vigilant. 6 months later, their daughter was born in the small hospital in Les Cayes. They named her Liberty, Libby for everyday use, a name that would have been impossible at Willow Creek, where children were typically named according to Martha's system of tracking bloodlines and traits. As Isaiah held his daughter for the first time, her tiny hand gripping his finger with surprising strength, he made a silent promise. She would never know life as property. She would never be an entry in someone else's ledger. Her value would never be calculated based on her potential productivity or breeding capacity. Liberty would grow up knowing herself as fully human, with all the dignity and possibility that entailed. The shadow of Willow Creek Plantation would not extend to this new generation. Life in Haiti proved challenging, but rewarding. Isaiah's position with the shipping company expanded as his employer recognized his intelligence and reliable character. Esther established a small but successful dressmaking business, her skillful needlework attracting clients from among the town's merchants and officials. Their humble home gradually acquired the comforts of a stable family life: simple furniture, books for future education, toys for their growing daughter. And then, on a sweltering afternoon in August 1852, nearly 2 years after their escape from Willow Creek, a letter arrived at the shipping office where Isaiah worked. The envelope bore no return address, but the Charleston postmark caught his attention immediately. With trembling hands, he broke the seal and unfolded the single page within. The letter was from Solomon, the elder who had been part of their original escape conspiracy at Willow Creek. In careful handwriting, he shared news that changed everything. Martha Thornton was dead. A sudden fever had taken her in the spring, Solomon explained. With no direct heirs, Willow Creek Plantation had been divided and sold to settle debts and fulfill bequests. The human property, over 100 people, had been distributed among various buyers, families separated according to the cold financial calculations of the estate executors. Her breeding journals were burned by the executor, Solomon wrote. He found them disturbing and unchristian. She is gone, but her legacy of suffering continues for many. Isaiah read the letter twice before folding it carefully and placing it in his pocket. That evening, he shared the news with Esther as they sat on the small porch of their home, watching 3-year-old Liberty playing in the garden. "Does it change anything for us?" Esther asked after a long silence. Isaiah considered the question, watching his daughter arrange pebbles in complex patterns that reflected her quick, orderly mind. "It means we don't need to look over our shoulders quite so vigilantly," he said finally. "Her personal vendetta died with her, but America remains what it was, a land where our daughter would be property, not a person." Esther nodded, understanding the complex truth of their situation. Martha Thornton's death freed them from the specific threat of her obsessive pursuit, but not from the larger system that had made her vision possible in the first place. "We're home now," she said, reaching for Isaiah's hand. "This is where liberty belongs, where her name means something real." As darkness fell over Les Cays, the family remained on their porch, listening to the distant sound of the Caribbean Sea and the closer sounds of community. Neighbors talking, children laughing, music playing from a nearby gathering. These were the sounds of freedom, imperfect, challenging, sometimes precarious, but genuine. Isaiah thought about Martha Thornton's red leather journal, her scientific approach to human breeding, her cold calculations of value and productivity, her perversion of faith to justify treating people as livestock. That journal was now ashes, but the thinking behind it persisted in plantations across the American South. "Someday," he said quietly, "there will be no more Willow Creeks. No more Martha Thorntons, no more human beings in account books." "Is that prophecy or hope?" Esther asked. "Both," Isaiah replied, watching Liberty arrange her pebbles in the last light of day. "It must be both." Years later, when Liberty was old enough to understand, they would tell her the story of Willow Creek Plantation, not to burden her with their trauma, but to help her understand the preciousness of her freedom and the importance of fighting for that same freedom for others. They would explain how her very existence represented a victory over Martha Thornton's vision of the world, a vision that reduced human beings to entries in a breeding journal. But tonight, they simply sat together in the gathering darkness, a family bound by choice and love rather than ownership and calculation. The shadow of Willow Creek Plantation would always be part of their past, but it no longer defined their future. That future belonged to Liberty, born free in body and spirit, her potential limited only by her own choices rather than by the cold entries in someone else's ledger. From the garden came Liberty's clear voice, counting her arranged pebbles with the precise articulation that always made her parents smile. She was her father's daughter in her love of numbers and patterns, her mother's in her steady determination. But unlike Isaiah and Esther, who had been valued for these traits as one might value advantageous characteristics in livestock, Liberty's abilities were simply part of her humanity, gifts to be nurtured for her own fulfillment rather than exploited for someone else's gain. In that moment, as the first stars appeared over Haiti, Isaiah and Esther knew with absolute certainty that their desperate flight from Willow Creek, with all its dangers and sacrifices, had been the only possible choice. Whatever challenges lay ahead in building their life in this new land, they faced them as free people, making free choices. Martha Thornton's doctrine had died with her, but their determination to live as fully human had only grown stronger with each day of freedom. The true victory over Willow Creek Plantation wasn't just in their escape, but in how they lived each day thereafter, making their own decisions, loving freely, raising their daughter to know her inherent dignity and worth. In a world that had tried to reduce them to property, their greatest rebellion was to live fully human lives, day after day, year after year, generation after generation. And that was a rebellion that could never be captured, no matter how far Martha Thornton's influence had reached in life, or how long the shadow of her cruel philosophy might linger after her death.